Joe Morgan walked down the uneven path leading to his small one-story house at the edge of town. With each step, gravel crunched beneath his boots, a sound he'd once found comforting, a reminder of long treks through foreign lands with his brothers in arms. Now it felt like a hollow echo, one that reminded him how quiet his life had become. Retirement had been more challenging than he'd anticipated. He'd left the rigid structure of the military, but nothing had filled the empty spaces it left behind. Joe took in the sight of the humble home he'd bought only a few months ago, a quaint place with faded shutters and an old porch swing he'd been meaning to fix. The town was quiet, nestled somewhere between the mountains and endless fields. Joe had chosen it for its peace, thinking that solitude would help him find himself again. But as the days bled into each other, he realized that peace without purpose wasn't the relief he'd expected. His days had fallen into a predictable routine. Mornings were spent working odd jobs in town or volunteering at the local veterans center. Afternoons, he'd help his elderly neighbor with her garden or mend broken fences. He found himself trying to fill his time, as if doing enough small tasks could chase away the empty feeling gnawing at him. But as much as he tried to stay busy, there was something missing, something he couldn't define. Evenings were the hardest. Alone in his quiet home, memories from the past crept in, uninvited. Memories of his best friend, Tom, who'd been more than a brother to him. They'd served together for years, until one fateful day when a roadside bomb had taken Tom's life, leaving Joe with nothing but grief and guilt. Joe sighed and unlocked the front door, letting himself into the house. He paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the sparsely furnished living room. It was functional, just enough for one man. A worn couch, a coffee table he'd built himself, and a single photograph of his squad, framed and sitting on the shelf. In it, Tom stood beside him, grinning with an arm slung around Joe's shoulders. They looked young, invincible, unaware of the pain that would come. He had friends here, he supposed, people he'd met through the community and those who respected him for his service. But friendships in town felt surface deep, like they were based more on his title as a war hero than on who he really was. In truth, Joe had struggled to find a purpose outside of the military. He'd been trained to protect, to serve, and without that mission he felt adrift. As he settled into his evening routine, warming up leftovers and sitting in silence with his dinner, he wondered if things would ever change. Some nights, the quiet was so oppressive that he almost wished for the chaos he'd left behind. But Joe reminded himself that this life was supposed to be his reward, a chance to heal and rest. Yet as the days went by, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that he was simply waiting for something to give his life meaning again. It was a stormy night when Joe heard the knock on his door. The wind had picked up just after dusk, whipping the trees outside and rattling the old shutters. Joe was sitting in his living room, half dozing in his chair, when a loud banging sound jolted him awake. He frowned, glancing at the clock. It was close to midnight. Who could possibly be out in this weather? He pulled on a jacket and went to the door, peering through the peephole. All he could make out were two small figures, huddled together under a soaked blanket. They looked cold, exhausted, and far too young to be wandering alone at this hour. Joe opened the door, and the two children looked up at him with wide, anxious eyes. The boy, who seemed to be about 13, held his sister close. She looked around 10, her face pale and shivering as she clutched her brother's arm. Are you Joe Morgan?" the boy asked, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Joe nodded, his heart pounding as he looked down at them. He noticed the resemblance immediately, the same sandy-brown hair, the shape of the boy's face. They looked like Tom. "My name's Jack, and this is my sister Emily," the boy said, his voice trembling, either from the cold or from nerves. "Our dad, he told us that if we ever needed help, we could come to you." Joe's breath caught. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't even known that Tom's kids would remember him, let alone seek him out. "Come inside," he said quickly, stepping back to let them into the warmth of the house. The children stepped in, looking around the sparsely decorated living room with wary eyes. Joe noticed how small and vulnerable they seemed, soaked through and shivering. He grabbed a couple of towels from the hallway closet, handing one to each of them. "Here, get yourselves dry. I'll get some tea going." He moved to the kitchen, his hands slightly unsteady as he filled the kettle. Memories of Tom flooded his mind, his old friend's laughter, his promise to be there for his kids no matter what. Joe remembered that promise, one they'd both made in quiet moments overseas, just in case something went wrong. When he returned, the children were huddled on the couch clutching the towels he'd given them. Jack was sitting straight, trying to look brave, while Emily leaned into him, her eyes wide with exhaustion. "Can you tell me what happened?" Joe asked gently, setting a steaming mug in front of each of them. Jack looked down, his jaw clenched. "Our mom, she passed away a few weeks ago. We didn't know what to do. They were going to put us in foster care, but we remembered. We remembered our dad talking about you. He said you'd help us if anything ever happened." Joe felt a lump in his throat. Tom's words echoed in his mind, words from years ago that he'd nearly forgotten. He'd promised to be there for Tom's kids if anything ever happened, and now, here they were, standing on his doorstep, desperate and alone. "Well," Joe said quietly, "you two are welcome to stay here, for as long as you need." Jack's face softened slightly, a flicker of relief passing over him. Emily, too young to fully understand the weight of what was happening, simply nodded and wrapped her hands around the warm mug. As he watched them, Joe felt an odd sensation, a mix of responsibility, protectiveness, and something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. He realized, in that moment, that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But he also knew he couldn't let them down. He'd made a promise, and he intended to keep it. The morning light crept through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the living room, where Jack and Emily slept curled up on the couch. Joe stood by the door, watching them with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. He hadn't slept much. His mind had been churning all night, wrestling with the sudden shift in his life and wondering how he would care for these two children. He took a breath and stepped into the kitchen, deciding to start the day the only way he knew how, with coffee for himself and breakfast for them. A memory of his own childhood surfaced as he moved through the kitchen. He remembered his mother's early morning breakfasts, the smell of bacon, the warmth of the kitchen on cold mornings. He realized he hadn't cooked breakfast for anyone in years, and the thought made his hands unsteady. Joe cracked a few eggs and attempted to fry some bacon, but it didn't go smoothly. He was out of practice, and soon the smell of burning bacon filled the kitchen. With a quiet curse, he tossed the ruined strips in the trash, feeling frustrated. "Need help?" The voice startled him, and he turned to see Jack standing in the doorway, watching him with tired eyes. The boy looked older than his years in that moment, as if he'd been forced to grow up far too quickly. It hit Joe how much responsibility Jack must feel, protecting his sister through all they'd been through. "Nah, I've got it under control," Joe said, forcing a smile. "But, maybe you could keep me company?" Jack gave a reluctant nod and took a seat at the kitchen table, where he watched as Joe managed to scramble a batch of eggs without further mishap. Soon, Emily joined them, rubbing her eyes and offering a shy smile. The three of them sat at the table, eating in silence. Joe didn't know what to say, and the kids seemed equally unsure. They ate slowly, each lost in their own thoughts, until Emily broke the quiet. "Do you have any pets?" she asked, looking up at Joe with a hopeful expression. Joe shook his head. "No pets here. Just me." "Oh," she said, her face falling slightly. "I always wanted a dog." Jack gave her a nudge with his elbow, a small warning look in his eyes. Joe understood. The kids were still getting used to this strange new life, and Jack was trying to protect his sister from getting too comfortable or too attached. After breakfast, Joe took them outside, showing them the small garden he'd started. It was mostly overgrown weeds, with a few struggling tomato plants he'd planted on a whim. "Figured I'd try my hand at gardening," he explained with a sheepish smile. "Turns out I'm not very good at it." Emily's eyes lit up as she looked around, and she kneeled down to inspect the tomato plants. "My mom loved gardening," she murmured, running her fingers over the leaves. A pang of sadness crossed Joe's face, but he managed a smile. Well, maybe you can teach me a thing or two. The day passed slowly, with Joe showing the kids around his small property. Jack remained mostly silent, watching his surroundings with guarded eyes, while Emily grew more curious, occasionally venturing a question or two. Joe sensed that she was the softer of the two, the one more willing to hope. Jack, on the other hand, was like a closed door, his pain locked tightly inside. As evening approached, Joe found himself exhausted. Raising children, even for a day, was more work than he'd expected. He had no idea how he was going to manage, especially with two kids who were carrying so much grief. But as he watched them settle on the couch that night, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging, of purpose. Over the next few days, Joe found himself adjusting to a new rhythm. Each morning he prepared breakfast, and each evening he tried to keep the kids entertained with small activities. He learned that Emily liked to draw and that Jack had a passion for basketball, although he rarely mentioned it. But despite Joe's efforts, Jack remained distant. It was clear that the boy resented being there, and he seemed determined to keep his walls up. Joe tried not to take it personally. He understood that Jack was struggling to process everything that had happened, and he knew that the boy was trying to be strong for his sister's sake. One afternoon, Joe decided to take them to the park. The sun was shining, and he thought a bit of fresh air might lift their spirits. They walked in silence, Joe occasionally pointing out small sights around town, but Jack's expression remained impassive. As they reached the park, Joe noticed a group of boys playing basketball on the court nearby. Jack's gaze lingered on them, a flash of longing in his eyes that he quickly tried to hide. Joe pretended not to notice. "Why don't you give it a try?" he said casually, nodding toward the court. "I can keep an eye on your sister." Jack hesitated, glancing at Emily, but she gave him a small smile and nudged him forward. Reluctantly, he walked toward the court, joining the other boys. Joe watched from a distance, seeing a different side of Jack emerge as he played. The boy's face softened, his movements becoming more fluid and confident. For a brief moment, Jack looked like a normal kid, free of the burdens he carried. Emily sat beside Joe on a bench, watching her brother with a soft smile. "He loves basketball," she murmured. "Our dad used to play with him." Joe's heart clenched at the mention of Tom. He remembered his friend teaching him about the game during their off hours overseas. Tom had always been a natural athlete, full of energy and laughter. Watching Jack on the court, Joe could see the resemblance, the same determination, the same spark. "You two must miss him a lot," Joe said gently. Emily nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "It doesn't feel real sometimes, like he's just away. But then I remember." Joe placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's okay to miss him, and it's okay to be sad. You don't have to be strong all the time." Emily looked up at him, her face softening as if she'd been holding in her emotions for too long. She leaned against him, and Joe put an arm around her, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through him. He was beginning to realize that he didn't just feel responsible for these kids, he was starting to care about them. As the days turned into weeks, Joe began to feel the weight of his new responsibilities. He was learning to cook more than just simple meals, managing school schedules, and trying to keep up with Emily's boundless curiosity and Jack's simmering frustration. Jack's resentment seemed to build each day, and Joe didn't know how to bridge the gap. One day, after coming home from running a few errands, Joe noticed something was off. His wallet, which he'd left on the kitchen counter, was open, and a small stack of bills was missing. He looked around, his heart sinking as he realized what had happened. Jack was sitting on the porch, staring out into the yard with a blank expression. Joe walked over and took a seat beside him, silence stretching between them. "Jack," Joe began, keeping his tone gentle, "did you take money from my wallet?" The boy's shoulders stiffened, and he looked away, refusing to answer. "Listen," Joe continued, trying to keep his frustration in check. "If you needed something, you could have asked me. I would have helped you out." Jack's jaw tightened, and he finally looked up, his eyes flashing with anger. "I don't need your help," he muttered. I don't need anything from you. The words stung, but Joe didn't back down. I get that you're angry. I get that you miss your dad, but stealing, that's not the way to deal with things. Jack's face reddened, and for a moment, Joe saw the pain behind his defiance. You're not my dad, he said, his voice breaking. You'll never be him. The words hung in the air, heavy and painful. Joe took a slow breath, steadying himself. You're right, Jack. I'll never be your dad. But I'm here now, and I'm doing my best to help you and Emily. I know it's not the same, and I know it's hard. But we've got to figure this out together. Jack didn't respond, and Joe could see the walls going up again. But he didn't push further. He knew that Jack needed time, and he was willing to wait. In the days that followed Jack's outburst, the tension between him and Joe lingered, thick and unspoken. Joe tried to be patient, to let Jack come around on his own time, but he couldn't help feeling like he'd hit a wall he couldn't break through. As much as he wanted to connect with the boy, to show him that he cared, Jack kept pushing him away. Joe knew that Jack was carrying the weight of his grief, but he wasn't sure how to help him carry it. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to be settling in. She'd started humming while she drew in the afternoons, filling the house with a quiet sense of warmth. Joe enjoyed the small moments with her planting flowers in the garden, watching her face light up at new blooms, and listening to her stories about the life she and Jack had before everything changed. One evening, Joe was sitting in the living room, reading the local paper, when he heard soft footsteps in the hallway. He looked up to see Emily, clutching a pillow and looking pale. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly, setting the paper aside. "Everything okay?" Emily hesitated, glancing down the hallway toward her bedroom. "I had a nightmare," she whispered, her voice trembling. Joe's heart softened, and he beckoned her over. She climbed onto the couch beside him, curling up against his side as he put an arm around her. "Do you want to talk about it?" She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's just, I miss them," she murmured, barely able to say the words. Joe nodded, holding her a little tighter. "I know, Emily. I miss them too. Your dad was. He was like family to me, and I know he'd be proud of you, of both of you." Emily's small hand found his, and she squeezed it. "Do you think he's watching us, somewhere?" Joe paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think so. I think he's watching, and I think he'd be really happy you came here. He'd want you to feel safe and loved." Emily's tears spilled over, but she managed a small smile. Joe brushed a hand over her hair, his heart swelling with a fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. In that moment, he realized that these children had become more than just a responsibility. They were his family now, in the way that really mattered. As weeks turned into months, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Joe still had moments of doubt, wondering if he was doing enough for the kids, if he was filling the void that their father's absence had left. But there were small signs that things were changing, that they were beginning to trust him. Emily's laughter became a regular sound in the house, and Joe found himself looking forward to her cheerful presence. She started helping him in the kitchen, experimenting with recipes she'd read about, even if they didn't always turn out as planned. One day, they'd attempted to bake cookies only to end up with a burnt, sticky mess. But Emily had laughed, her face flushed with joy, and Joe couldn't help but join in. Jack, however, remained guarded. He'd speak to Joe when he had to, answer questions when directly asked, but he still held his emotions close, keeping Joe at arm's length. Joe tried not to push, hoping that with time, Jack would feel safe enough to let his walls down. Then, one afternoon, Jack didn't come home from school. Joe had expected him around 4, but by 5:30, there was still no sign of him. Joe's worry grew, and he decided to head into town to see if anyone had seen him. He found Jack at the basketball court, alone, shooting hoops as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Joe approached slowly, watching as Jack took shot after shot with focused intensity. He looked up, noticing Joe, and paused, his face unreadable. "Why didn't you come home?" Joe asked gently. Jack shrugged, dribbling the ball without meeting Joe's eyes. "Didn't feel like it." Joe took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm. "Look, Jack, I get it. I'm not your dad, and I'm not trying to replace him. But I'm here because I care about you and Emily. You two are all I've got now. You're my family." Jack's shoulders tensed, and he looked away, his face tight with frustration. "You don't get it. You don't know what it's like." Joe's heart clenched, but he kept his tone steady. "Then tell me, Jack. Help me understand." For a moment, Jack looked like he might say something, but he clenched his jaw and shook his head, his expression hardening. Joe sighed, knowing that pushing wouldn't help. He watched as Jack took another shot, the ball swooshing through the hoop. "You're a good player," Joe said after a pause. "Did your dad teach you?" Jack's expression softened slightly. "Yeah. He used to play with me all the time." A silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions. Finally, Jack looked down, his voice barely a whisper. I miss him, and I don't know how to stop missing him." Joe nodded, feeling the ache in his own heart. "You don't have to stop, Jack. Missing him doesn't mean you can't move forward. It just means you loved him, and he was important to you." Jack's face crumpled, and for the first time, he let the tears come. Joe stepped forward, wrapping an arm around him, letting him cry. It was a small breakthrough, a glimpse of the boy underneath the walls he'd built. With each passing day, Joe felt the bonds between him and the kids growing stronger. He started small traditions like pancake breakfasts on Sundays and movie nights on Fridays. Jack and Emily began to look forward to these moments, and the house felt warmer, filled with laughter and companionship. One Sunday morning, as they sat around the breakfast table, Joe decided to bring up a topic he'd been considering for a while. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, glancing at both of them, "about making things official, becoming your legal guardian." Jack and Emily exchanged glances, both looking surprised. Emily's face lit up, but Jack's expression was more guarded. I want to make sure that you two have a stable home, a place you know is yours for as long as you need it," Joe explained. "But only if you're okay with it." Emily's face broke into a grin. "Really, Uncle Joe?" Joe chuckled. "Really?" Jack looked down, his expression unreadable. Joe waited, giving him space to process. Finally, Jack looked up, his gaze meeting Joe's. "You really mean that?" he asked quietly, a vulnerability in his voice that Joe hadn't heard before. "I do," Joe said. "I know I'm not your dad, but I'm here for you, Jack. I'm not going anywhere." After a long pause, Jack gave a small nod. It wasn't much, but to Joe it felt like a promise, a silent acceptance of the family they were slowly becoming. A month later, their newfound stability was tested when Emily came down with a high fever. Joe stayed up all night, sitting by her bedside, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth and worrying over every little cough and whimper. Jack hovered nearby, his face pale with anxiety, watching as Joe cared for his sister. As the night wore on, Jack finally spoke. "I don't know what I'd do if something happened to her." Joe put a reassuring hand on Jack's shoulder. "We're not going to let that happen. She's strong, just like her dad." Jack nodded, and for the first time he seemed to trust that Joe could handle things, that he was truly there for them. By morning, Emily's fever had broken, and they all breathed a sigh of relief. In that moment, Joe realized how deeply he cared for both of them. He wasn't just their caretaker or their guardian, he was their family. They had chosen each other, and in doing so, they'd become something stronger than blood. A few weeks later, Joe stood in the courthouse holding Emily's hand and exchanging a smile with Jack. They'd come to finalize the guardianship papers, making his role in their lives official. It was a small ceremony, but to Joe it felt monumental. After the paperwork was done, they celebrated with ice cream and a long walk through the park. As they laughed and talked, Joe realized how much he'd changed since the day he opened his door to find them standing there. He felt complete in a way he hadn't in years. As they returned home, Emily tugged on Joe's sleeve. "Can we take a picture? Like a family picture?" Joe smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I'd like that, Em." They took the photo in front of the house, their arms around each other, grinning. It was a small thing, but to Joe, it was everything. He knew now that family wasn't just about who you were born to. it was about who you chose to love and protect. Years later, Joe would look back on that picture, remembering the journey they'd taken together. Jack had grown into a confident young man, and Emily had become a talented artist. Joe watched them thrive, feeling grateful for the unexpected family that had given his life new purpose. In the end, he'd found what he was looking for all along, a mission worth dedicating his life to. A family that, though unexpected, had become his reason for living. And as he watched Jack and Emily laugh and play in the yard, Joe knew he'd found his home. To hear more, click the video on the screen, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell.